Let's move on to chapter 4 in your book, Amor Mundi. And I wonder if the destructive tendency that you talk about in there, if that's related to communism, if you see communism as an avenue for the destructive elements that happen in society.
Yeah, so you mentioned, in Romania, especially under communism, I wrote another book called Gardens, Reflections on the Human Condition.
And actually, that's a segue. I want to show it right here. We won't get into it today, but
no.
If you want to mention something.
So it's gardens not only in the literal sense, but also what is the activity of gardening and caretaking, when the gardener is a caretaker of the plot of land. But it also has served, as a figure for governments. And I mention in that book that there's two kinds of concepts of state. One in which the citizens are the caretakers and cultivators of the state. The other is a kind of totalitarian, communistic idea that the state is the caretaker of the citizens. And I think that where you have a government or a state which presumes to be the caretaker of the citizens, you do not encourage the citizens to develop that heart that is committed to the public good. Yeah. It's where citizens believe that they are the gardeners and cultivators and caretakers of the state, that's where I think you have a different ethic that takes over. Let's say it's the communist state or some other kind of fascist state in which the state presumes to be the caretakers of the citizens. This creates a certain cynicism in the people, a certain indifference, a lack of responsibility, and I think that it explains a difference in the heart of people in one system and the heart of people in another system. And I do believe that that communism in theory and also in practice is not based on an ethic of care and of help, but that it is highly driven by ideological dogma that does not engage the citizen in the productive way. And it also relies on the assumption that everything that preceded the communist state belongs to a past that was dominated by oppression, prejudice, superstition, and ignorance. And therefore, it declares war on the past. And it has as one of its principal missions to consign the past to oblivion. Therefore, it's huge rupture. And that's where I think a lot of the destructive nature of communism resides, in this idea that you can completely cut a people off from their historical and cultural past and create a nation that is based on abstract ideas. Like any state that believes in the iron laws of history is going to be a destructive state, in my view, because it's so assured of the righteousness of its cause that it feels justified to use any means necessary to achieve its own ends. Many atrocities and crimes have been committed by this conviction of being on the right side of history. I don't believe in the right or wrong side of history. Those who do believe in the right side of history, watch out, I think.
In the epilogue of your book, Juvenescence, you talk about this concept of Americanization. And I want to ask you about that. I think you gave a fantastic depiction of what that means. And you talk about a cube that is the United States or is America. And then the reflection of this cube that ends up being a square. If you project a cube on a wall, all you see is a square. It's a two-dimensional element, right? And other countries, or this Americanization exists as a square in other countries instead of the actual cube. And I want you to talk about it, but I feel that the mere conversation we're having today is more of the cube
Yes.
versus the square that other countries perceive of America. Your thoughts?
Right. Well, I'm glad you say that, because it's. I'm very committed to the cube over the square, because the cube has 3 dimensions, the square has 2 dimensions, and so much of our reality today is determined by the screen. It could be the movie screen, the television screen, the computer screen, or the cell phone screen, and namely a 2-dimensional world where everything has lost a 3rd dimension. So I hope our conversation has been more 3-dimensional than 2-dimensional. And yes, so Americanization, I think, is a world event. It even America's worst enemies, it could be the terrorists and things like that. You can find them wearing American blue jeans and American sneakers and using American cell phones, and the whole phenomenon of Americanization, I think, has become a global phenomenon.
Maybe tell our audience more exactly what you mean by that. So it's not just the McDonald's or the Walmart or the cell phones, right? It's a whole culture that somehow gets represented overseas, right?
Right. So this idea of the cube and the square is projective geometry, and it's this idea that America, it's not the 3-dimensional America that is being exported abroad. It's a very reduced version of America, which is the McDonald's and the mentalities, the youthful. And I think part of the appeal, universal appeal of Americanism, has to do with the essential youthfulness of this American culture, post-war American culture. Not only youthful, I think it's more almost even infantilized part of the American thing. And therefore, when it's exported abroad, it's not the virtues of America that get exported. Oftentimes, it's the vices. It's so much easier to export a vice than a virtue. And I'm not saying that Americanization is necessarily only an element of vice. I'm saying that it's very interesting how there is a universal conquering of the rest of the world through a phenomenon of youthfulness that we've never seen before in history. And I think it has to do with the fact that our human species has a substrate, a neotenic substrate, that favors all forms of youthfulness, and there's something ultimately oppressive about excessive authority and maturity and the dowdiness and the gray, and there is an intrinsic appeal to the kind of liberation that Americanism represents. And yet, if you export only the youthful side of America, it's not going to have much of a future, because America is this almost miraculous amalgamation of a youthfulness combined with a certain kind of wisdom of maturity. And that's why it was a successful Neotenic revolution, by which, as I defined it, youthful characteristics achieve new levels of maturity. So it's the difference between rejuvenation and juvenilization. Too much of Americanization is juvenilization, I think.
Speaking of that, why, I agree with you, but why do you think it's easier to export the bad elements versus the virtues in anything that you do, pretty much? Why do those bad elements catch on fire much easier? Maybe it's a $1 million question, but I would still like to hear what you think.
Well, virtue is always difficult. It's also the difference between building and destroying.
Yes.
It's much easier to destroy something
Yes.
than to build something.
Yes.
This is the terrible logic of bombs. You can destroy overnight something that takes centuries and centuries to build. When it comes to vice and virtue, it's also true in almost the vast majority of relationships. The vice of one of the partners will end up getting the better of the virtue of the other, rather than the other way around. And this is
It's
rather
human nature.
pessimistic, but unfortunately, if you have a virtuous husband and a wife who has vice, or vice versa, it's oftentimes it's easier to pull someone down than to pull someone up. So I'm very sorry to realize time and again that America's virtues are so difficult to export to the rest of the world.
How much of the vices of American culture that are being portrayed have to do with Hollywood or TV? Is it majority of it, do you think, or part of it?
I think Hollywood is a mixed blessing. There's some things that Hollywood has exported which have served the common good. I mean the global common good, I'm saying, because many of its stories are about the good versus the bad, and Hollywood has served as an immoral education for people all around the world in a certain way.
But it almost became the standard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then it becomes this kind of, again, theater of geometric projection where everything is a two-dimensional reality rather than the thing itself. I think that Hollywood has a role to play, but consumerism, I think, is even more important. American consumerism is also something that America has an interest to export because it profits. It creates markets of desire. So Hollywood, television, these things are part of the engendering of desires where there were no such desires existed before. So when you see all of a sudden that there's Twinkies or there's Mickey Mouse or there's things that you can have, I mean, the rest of the world through television or advertising or something, all of a sudden they compare themselves to a society that looks in the two-dimensional form like a Garden of Eden, that everyone is living in a state of complete bliss and beatitude, of material well-being, and therefore this encouragement that all of our happiness and self-satisfaction comes from consumption, I think is very dangerous as an export abroad, because it furthers the idea that we are consumers rather than citizens. There's a difference between being a citizen and being a consumer, but oftentimes American consumerism blurs that distinction entirely